Now, the Kaduna State government has released its latest annual and quarterly report on insecurity, and it makes for rather grim reading. It shows the alarming persistence of insecurity in the state, with a troubling escalation of challenges such as terrorism, banditry, kidnappings, revenge killings, and the list goes on. Obviously, the Kaduna State report is focused on the state, but it could potentially be a microcosm of the wider picture across Nigeria. And it corresponds broadly with the latest independent intelligence security analysis from the respected security firm Beacon Consulting, which contains lots of violence and kidnappings, but also a long list of election-related assaults. So when you combine the Kaduna State and the Beacon Consulting reports, what emerges is a very stark warning of more bloodshed to come. So what will the incoming government need to do to turn things around, deliver nuggets of optimism, and prevent the catastrophe of insecurity from getting worse? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the CEO and founder of the West African Risk Management and Intelligence Security firm, Beacon Consulting, Dr. Kabir Adamu, who is one of the authors of the latest Beacon Security Report. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
My pleasure, Charles.
Haven't seen you in a while, so it's nice to see you in person.
Same here. I was checking the chair earlier on to see if I could fit into. The last time I saw someone was defining fascism on this chair.
Well, good to see you. Now, just summarize for us your latest report on insecurity in Nigeria. There seems to have been a slowdown in things like terrorism and banditry for a bit during the election period, but that was replaced by election-related violence.
No, definitely. So the last report we released, which is March 2023, covered the month of March. And then, of course, because it's the end of the first quarter of the year, we also did an analysis of the first quarter of the year. So what we saw in that period was in the month of January, compared to the month of December, there was an almost 60% reduction in fatalities and kidnapping. And then by February, there was a further reduction. Sadly, however, by March, the two figures combined, what we experienced in March was even higher than the 2 months combined. And then, of course, when we looked deeper, what was the common feature? In February, there was a significant deployment of security forces, and rightly so, to provide an environment for elections to hold. Now, towards the end of March, after the governorship elections, that deployment was pulled back, mostly to the various places where they were brought in from. And so that opened up the spaces, and then we saw a resumption of the activities of particularly non-state armed groups in almost all the locations where we saw a resurgence of security challenges. It was this single factor, non-state armed groups. Surprisingly, however, the Southeast remained slightly different. We didn't see a resumption of the level of insecurity that we witnessed in December and in January, all through the month of March. Specifically, the last month, or the last week rather, of the month of March was when we saw most of these incidents that represented the increase in terms of the frequency of incidents that we monitored.
Very interesting. And I'm wondering whether the reduction in the availability of cash in Nigeria had anything to do with it, particularly in areas such as kidnapping, for example, which is often done for ransom. And, you know, if you don't have cash, then what's the point?
Yeah, so what we did in February, we did a deep analysis where we tried to correlate the cash crunch, of course, the monetary policy, and security challenges. Yes, at that point, there appeared to be a correlation. However, but by March, that correlation appeared to have filtered away. First off, the anecdotal information in the locations where the incidents were happening, the general perception by most people is that now there is more cash in their hands. That is why we're seeing a resumption. But we tried to remind, especially since we've got like a wide collection capability, that no, that's not the only reason. Like I said, the security deployment that coincided with the elections.
That's very significant.
Prevented these non-state armed groups from operating. But immediately after the elections, we saw a reduction of that deployment. And so there was a resumption. So it's not just a single factor. There are several other factors that may have led to it. Now, there is also a suggestion, even though it's something we're still looking at, that perhaps because of the political dimension of some of the activities of these non-state armed groups, during the elections, they were occupied with quote-unquote the elections, which is why we saw an increase in political violence in that period. But now that they've been kind of freed, their reins are out there, then they've gone back to what they traditionally would do.
So it is fair then to say that once again, insecurity is creeping up in Nigeria.
No, definitely. Just even the figures speak about that. Like I explained, in January, we recorded about, I think, 600 fatalities. In February, it was 400, but by March, it had increased to 900. So almost doubling. If you add the two figures for January and February, what we saw in March was represented. So clearly, there is an increase in terms of the fatalities. And I must emphasize that what we present is the best accurate figures that we could represent. It does not represent in totality the fatalities that have been. Some are not reported, as an example. We are confident, however, that our collection capabilities represents what can be verified and a reflection of the dimension of insecurity in Nigeria. So clearly it's increasing.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you out of curiosity how you get all the data for your reports and how you do your sort of inter-comparisons, work out the biases and draw your conclusions.
So our collection capability cuts across two broad areas. What in intelligence term is called human intelligence. So we've got assets, quote unquote, deployed across the 36 states of the Federation and sometimes even at the local government level. Then there is the open source intelligence, which is called OSINT. And we've recently, starting from December, incorporated AI into our collection capabilities. So it's a combination of all of this. Once any of either the human or the OSINT picks it up, we try to verify it, corroborate it, and then it enters our database. Anytime we're not able to, then we're not going to use that particular incident.
Very good. And where have you seen this increase and prevalence of violence much more in Nigeria now? I mean, you said it wasn't quite as it used to be in the southeast, but where has it shown more prevalence? So
from a state-by-state basis, it's been Zamfara, Kaduna, to an extent Borno State, and I think Niger State, where we saw. So most of the northwestern, north central states, where we've seen an increase in the type of incidents that we're monitoring. We highlight about 15 different security challenges. So depending on what you are looking at, banditry is the one that kind of, in terms of the extent of fatalities for a particular event. For banditry, you could see one incident creating up to 200 deaths. So clearly, we pay a lot of attention to that. But for criminal issues, especially where the objective is financial, we're seeing an increase in the southwestern part of the country, Ondo State, Oyo State to an extent, and then parts of Ogun State, as well as Lagos, where we're seeing low-level criminality, kidnap for ransom, gang violence, and then some of the other challenges. So it depends on the particular issue, but like I said, for banditry, it's Kaduna, Zamfara, Katsina, and to an extent Niger State. And
the election-related violence was more across the country, was it?
Not necessarily. Kano stood out. Lagos also stood out. And then in the post-election violence, especially the wild jubilation that followed the elections, Zamfara State stood out. In fact, in Zamfara State, there was a particular incident on election day where 51 persons was killed, and it received very little attention, sadly. Even though it was not, the objective was not political. They did not say that the reason why they attacked was political, but it happened on election day. 51 persons. And then, of course, Kano too, sadly, recorded several, politically related incidents, and there were lots of fatalities. So Kano and Zamfara, I think, were, in terms of the level of fatalities unrelated to political violence, were the highest.
And you mentioned Kaduna State previously. Governor Nasir El-Rufai of Kaduna State has called for an escalation of security operations over the remaining days till the end of the Buhari administration, so that the change of government, according to him, does not create a gap for criminals to exploit. And he was speaking in the context of what appears to be a rise in attacks in Kaduna State, which you have corroborated. Well, what's your assessment of what he's suggesting?
So his conclusions are kind of corroborated ours as well. Earlier on, I spoke about an increase in security deployment in the month of the election, which is February, into March, when the governorship elections was rescheduled. And that's basically what Governor Rufai is saying, although he traced his back to the end of 2022, where he said, you know, I agree with him, new operations were, you know, put forward by the military, and I think this followed a presidential directive. So as an example of Operation Forest Sanity, I think it's called, that was in the last quarter of 2022 into this first quarter of 2023. So clearly there was an intensity of military operations, and that may have led to a reduction in some of the security challenges that we're seeing. But the point El-Rufai made, which perhaps he didn't bring out clearly, is the sustainability of that operation. First off, it's a very expensive venture. And as you know, we're challenged by, I'm sure you're probably going to talk about that at some point. So how sustainable would it be to maintain that tempo of security operations, especially given the fact that the deployments are not deployments based in Kaduna State. Some of the deployments are coming from other locations. So maintaining them comes with additional cost. Likewise, for instance, the air component of all of that, it comes with huge cost. So that, I think, is what Governor Rufai is probably referring to. And I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was a little bit excited when I heard that governors were coming to Abuja to have discussions with the federal government regarding the security vote. So that's one area that I felt Governor Rufai should have come forward. I know most of the governors are using their security vote to support federal security operations, but it's not a transparent process. We need to see more transparency in that process. There are models that I think we could build upon. The Lagos model is a good one. Lagos has a security trust fund. It's run like a project, it's transparent. If you want to know how much was spent on who, where, you would know. But most other states don't have that. So I would like to see going forward perhaps that type of collaboration and transparency within the security sector that says what contribution the federal government is giving. And then, of course, El-Rufai has also advocated for state policing. And I know that this is something that hopefully, given his rule and his position in both the current government and hopefully the incoming government, we hope he lives by that promise that he has indicated. He called for it, so I'm hoping that he will work towards at least a level of decentralization. I think state police is really taking it to the extent, but I would love to see a decentralization of security or policing functions in the country.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about going forward. But before we go forward, let's go backwards, because we heard it said repeatedly by the outgoing Buhari government that they were on top of insecurity, or were aiming to be. How would you assess their fight against insecurity as they prepare to leave office?
So let's use data and try to assess the performance of this administration. 2013 into 2014 was when one of the non-state armed groups in Nigeria gained the infamous recognition of being the world's deadliest terror group, and that is the Jamaat al-Ahl Sunnah lil-Dawat wal-Jihad, that we all call Boko Haram. In that year, 13,000 Nigerians were killed. Now, going into 2014, 2015, that number reduced to around 7,000 when President Buhari became president. That's 2015. What we've seen almost consistently is an average of 5,000, 6,000 Nigerians being killed from that period. However, by 2022, of course, a pre-election year, that number increased to 11,000 Nigerians. So it's neither here nor there. I cannot sit down and say, for instance, if 5,000 or 6,000 Nigerians die in a year, that I'm happy. No, I'm not happy. I would like to wake up to a situation where perhaps less than 100 Nigerians are killed in a year, and I'll be happy. Well, has progress been made? Yes, progress has been made. So that is data. How about the security sector itself? And one area that we don't speak enough about is security sector governance. All the things that you need to put in place to make sure security delivers on its component, and that's mentioned in section 14, subsection 2 of the Constitution, which is the protection of life and property. Now, in terms of security sector governance, I think the Buhari administration did a couple of things that deserve commendation. So it looked at some of the laws that establishes some of the security organizations. The most pivotal is the Police Act. It revised the Police Act and attempted to democratize that Police Act. Before then, it revised the National Security Strategy and promised us that there will be a transition from state-centric approach to security to a human-centric approach. Sadly, what we haven't seen for both of these very important laws is the implementation component.
Right.
So the platform has been created. I can also speak about several others, the Police Trust Fund, which, of course, they took over from the Jonathan administration, but then there were some teething problems, and they were able to set it forward, and today it's functional. Now, as part of the Police Act, today we have at least the policy for community policing has been created. Constables have been recruited. But is it operational? It's not operational because there are some challenges. We can also talk about equipment repository for almost all the law enforcement and armed forces. I think this administration has invested in those components beyond any of the other administrations in the Fourth Republic. So all of that are very positive development. But have they translated to a reduction in fatalities and an improvement in security? Sadly, there is room for improvement.
Right, okay, well, talking about that room, because we've got a couple of minutes to go. I mean, your analysis, fascinating and interesting as always, but obviously it is the responsibility of the incoming government to make Nigeria safe and to continue from where the previous government left off. How should they do this? What should their priorities be? And how much of a challenge will insecurity be for that next government?
It will be a huge challenge. In fact, we wouldn't be wrong if we'd say it's going to be an existential challenge. The political, the dynamics that was associated with the 2023 elections has created a new challenge, which is the division within Nigerians. And that, sadly, may increase the security challenges that we're having. Wherever there are features like that, persons are going to exploit it. So those structural features will be exploited by several non-state armed groups to recruit, to create further division, and then, of course, continue the insecurity challenge. So that's the first task. How do they close up that feature? The tectonic templates upon which Nigeria lies, ethnicity and religion, has been shaken by the political dimension. So the first task will be how to close all of that. Now, we've been presented with a renewed hope manifesto. And I've taken my time, I've read that renewed hope. There are 7 elements that have been promised by the incoming administration. Now, all of those elements are pretty good. Changing the philosophy, the doctrine behind security policies in Nigeria, improving the equipment repository, training, welfare, increasing the manpower, strength, and all of that. The few areas that have not been extensively discussed, example, the security sector governance that I talked about earlier on. For me, it is the glue that puts together everything security. And if we don't get that right, then sadly, whatever we invest, it will be tantamount to fetching water with a basket.
Right.
And that, for me, should be the beginning. Look at the security sector, especially the coordinating elements within the security sector. And I'll quickly mention them: the Office of National Security Advisor, the Ministers of Defense, Police Affairs, Interior, and then, of course, the Secretary to Government of the Federation, and to an extent, the Chief of Staff to the President. And to an extent, these are the coordinating elements within the security sector. Now, it's like having several cooks, in the kitchen. They will be knocking their heads, and that's the situation we have at the moment. There are also some grumblings regarding the operations of some of these coordinators. Now, we need to look at that. Where there are issues of collaboration, cooperation, and coordination, then you need to look at security sector governance. The second component, also related to security sector governance, is accountability. We've seen severally over the years where there are massive failures in security and nobody is held to account. So in improving security sector governance, we need to introduce M&E, monitoring and evaluation, and auditing functions so that we hold to account failures. I can give you the example of the Kaduna-bound train, the Owo Church incident, the Kuje incident, where, as far as I'm aware, no one was held accountable. We need to introduce that level of M&E so that persons are held accountable. And then lastly, we need to introduce elements of some of these changes within the mandate of the security sector. I talked about the revised national security strategy. Name them. There are about 6 documents that have been introduced by the Buhari administration. Cyber security, which we haven't spoken, there is a policy on that. We need to implement it, and implement it in a manner that allows accountability. So where there are failures, we hold the persons who perhaps created those gaps. But for me, once we improve on security sector governance, then all of these things, this magnificent thing that the Buhari administration have done, will be glued together and we'll start seeing the result. At the end of the day, what matters is that you and I, we feel safer. The moment the Nigerians feel safer, then I think the desire in the 7-point agenda, which is to win the hearts and minds of the people, the government will start seeing that.
Absolutely sterling analysis, I have to say. Dr. Kabir Adamu, always brilliant to see you and to get the benefit of your assessment. And Dr. Kabir Adamu is CEO and founder of the West African risk management and intelligence security firm Beacon Consulting. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.